Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Nadia McConnell, president of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation, and I want to welcome everybody to this most timely, critical discussion that we have about Ukraine's road to NATO. And I guess in some ways we could say from Vilnius and looking forward to Washington next July. I am very pleased and honored to have with us four esteemed experts who will update us on the current state of affairs and will be able to provide perhaps, along with some concerns about developments, but also provide us with some good news. We really only have an hour, so we will ask if you have Q&A questions, please put them in the Q&A, and if we are not able to get to them during the session, we will see if we can respond to you via email post this webinar. I'm not going to take a lot of time for introduction so we can get right into the questions, but let me start first introducing Sergio Germani from Italy, who has done an incredible amount of research on the whole issue of disinformation and narratives. And we previously had a few weeks ago a discussion about his first research paper about the various narratives that have played in Italy regarding Ukraine's war in various timeframes. Today, we are Sergio will be talking about the research that he's done regarding NATO and the whole issue of the use of nuclear weapons in Italy. These papers are on our website, and I urge you to read them. I've said several times that the detailed research that Sergio has presented or produced really could be a template where for anybody to look at any narratives in any country and just take his template, substitute the Italian names with whatever country you wanted to analyze, because he goes into great detail about the various players, media, influencers, government officials, organizations. So welcome to Sergio. We also have with us, we are also very honored to have with us Zygmanis Pavlionis, who most of us remember as being one of the great ambassadors to the United States from Lithuania. He's been a great friend of the United States and of Ukraine, and most recently has been leading the efforts within Europe to support Ukraine's accession into NATO, and has led a delegation of members of the chairman of various parliamentary committees in various departments and countries. And I'm sure he will talk about the process of what happened, getting it organized, and where things stand today. Then we also have Ambassador Kurt Volker, distinguished fellow at SIPA, former ambassador to NATO, and a special representative for Ukraine negotiations. And I will also say a great member of our Friends of Ukraine network. Ian Brzezinski also almost doesn't need any introduction. Ian currently is a senior fellow at NATO Council and a former deputy assistant for Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO, and actually had been in Ukraine from the very beginning in the early 90s, and can talk to us about that road that began way back then and where we find ourselves today. So let's get to the discussion. Let's start with Sergio. Sergio, if you could for us tell us about the various narratives that you identify regarding what we see in Italy, which could probably be, as I said, replicated and analyzing other countries. What are the main narratives that seem to have been working in Italy regarding NATO, but also the use of potential nuclear weapons by Russia?
So yes, please. Okay. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yes. Well, just to summarize, the narratives that that Russian propaganda and pro-Russian influencers in Italy have been pushing for years actually have their origins in the Cold War. In the Cold War, the Russians the Soviets spread different kinds of narratives about NATO and about U.S. foreign policy. For example, that NATO was an organization that had a militaristic, adventurous foreign policy that was pushing Europe and the world toward nuclear war, right? And also that the U.S. and NATO nuclear policies were also extremely dangerous for the world, that they were pushing the world toward a nuclear holocaust. That was way back in the 1980s, right? 1970s, 1980s. Now, all of these narratives have been, when the Putin regime relaunched the active measures tradition, right? Propaganda, disinformation, subversion of various kinds. They kind of picked up all of the Cold War narratives and revived them and used them as to influence perceptions in Italian public opinion and in the Italian decision makers. So they have different kind of narratives. Some were more oriented toward the masses, toward mass consumption, which in fact they were more kind of simpler, more primitive. Others were more sophisticated and geared toward influencing the perceptions of the elite, of the Italian elite, the political elite, the economic elite, the academics, and so on. So you have narratives, for example, about nuclear, that US and NATO nuclear policies are pushing the world toward nuclear war, and they began intensifying this after the U.S. Kind of walked out of the INF treaty, because actually it was the Russians' fault because they had violated the treaty. But the U.S. administration walked out of the treaty. And but then a very strong disinformation campaigns were conducted all over the world, in particular in Italy, saying that the US and NATO nuclear policies were pushing the world more and more toward nuclear war, and that the US no longer had a kind of deterrence nuclear posture, but they had a new kind of nuclear doctrine based on first strike, that the US wanted to conduct a first strike against Russia, first nuclear strike, thus pushing the world toward nuclear war. So all these things were completely false, right? But they had influence. This is one kind of narrative. Another kind was that NATO completely eliminated Italy's sovereignty, the possibility for Italy to have a sovereign foreign and defense policy, that Italy is a kind of colony of the US and of some influencers say also of Great Britain, because Italy is in NATO. And that so that this kind of thing has eliminated the possibility of Italy pursuing its own national interest. Now, this is another kind of persistent narrative. A third kind of narrative is that NATO and the US want to destroy Russia, and they are using the Ukraine, that actually the origins of the war in the Ukraine are the fact that the US and NATO are using the Ukraine in order to pursue their goal of weakening and destroying Russia. This is the narrative, right? Which is pushed by various kinds of influencers, not only by Russian propaganda, by Russian state propaganda, but also by Italian influencers. There are some more sophisticated versions of this narrative, saying that the war in the Ukraine, the origin of the war in the Ukraine, you should look for it in NATO expansion. What some of these influencers call NATO expansion. They see NATO as a kind of empire that is expanding more and more to the east, threatening Russia and so on. They are careful not to say that it's not really expansion, but it's Eastern European countries, the Baltics and so on, that wanted to join NATO because they perhaps they understood Russia better than we did. The risk that Russia might regain this kind of imperialistic foreign policy. Maybe they understood that in the 1990s, and we didn't perceive that very clearly, right? But the narrative is that NATO has expanded, and in expanding, it's threatening more and more world peace because it wants to, because its real hidden aim is to weaken, encircle Russia, and then eventually destroy it, which is the same kind of Kremlin Siloviki narrative that, that you hear people like Putin and Patrushev say. So this is another kind of, and there are many more. There's a wide variety of narratives. If I can just mention one more, or perhaps later on if you want. Just one more is that this is a more sophisticated narrative, saying that the real aim of American foreign policy is to divide Europe from Russia, because Washington, according to this narrative, is afraid that if Europe gets together with Russia, they would form a kind of big Eurasian economic bloc that would threaten U.S. hegemony. So the aim is to divide, to create tensions between Russia and Europe, and that's why, and that's how they explain the Ukraine crisis in 2014, and now the war. They explain it as a result of U.S. policy. So this is a kind of. So I would stop that.
Okay, thank you so much. So it's for those of us like you and I who were sort of born into this world, it seems to me that some of these narratives that seem to take hold, you just wonder how that could possibly be. And perhaps, as Sergio has pointed out, because those who come from Ukraine or the Baltics or Eastern Ukraine understood and have known what Russia is for decades, if not centuries. So, Sigis, if you could walk us through, I guess, the work that you have been doing, first of all, I think to unite more of Europe, right, to understand the situation and to support Ukraine's NATO accession. So if you could walk us through what you were doing in terms of organizing this incredible coalition that you built, and then you came to the United States before the Vilnius summit. And if I recall, you were somewhat disappointed in the results in Vilnius. So walk us through that before we go to the future.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this opportunity, especially with old friends who brought us to NATO, Kurt, Jan, and well, just referring to what was just said, Russia was always dividing and trying to rule us. But Russia was mostly provoked by our weakness, as they understand it. In Bucharest, when we didn't make those decisions that was made for Central Europeans and the Baltics, when membership action plan was blocked to Ukraine and Georgia, Russia invaded Georgia. As we understand, they invaded Ukraine because of weakness showed by the West in Afghanistan. They understood that the West is so weak that they can do it. And they created this huge invasion. But I think there they miscalculated. With all my heart, like Lithuanian, who was not listened for like 20 years, except in some capitals like Washington, I can say that February 24 united Europeans, first of all, as never before. Let's start referring to Italy. Actually, it was wrong to help us unite Europeans first on candidate status for Ukraine, that would open the doors and soon maybe even accession talks to European Union. It was Draghi government, still center-left government, to do it, help unite us with all other left social democrat forces. And then when the government changed, it was Chairman Tremonti and former Foreign Minister Giulio Terzi. You remember him. He was also ambassador during my term in DC. They helped us to get the first signatures of those chairmen of Foreign Affairs Committee asking to open the doors to NATO membership. Italians. I got Italian signature first before I got German. Then British, then French, then I got all the signatures, all except maybe a few chairmen who were still in elections. It was Greek and Spanish, but I know that they were with me. Finally, I got the signature of Chairman McCall, Republican one, who even made a hearing on the Hill asking administration to follow this European lead and open the doors to NATO, invite, as we say, Ukraine to membership talks. That doesn't mean Article 5, just invite the beginning of the process, because it had to mirror this European effort. Today in Europe, in December, well, we are first of all waiting November 8th, when the Commission will recommend start accession talks as we hope with Ukraine. And then in December we meet and we decide as Europeans, we are starting accession process with Ukrainians. But then we will all come to Washington and ask, what about you? So I didn't mention that I didn't get democratic signature. I didn't get signature of Chairman Menendez on that statement, and that was indicative. And finally, how to make it mild, I was so shocked to see American administration not actually moving, the only, more or less only administration not actually moving on this question in Vilnius. So I remind you, in Bucharest, we were blocked by Paris and Berlin, but in Vilnius, by American administration. What I didn't know in Vilnius, as it seems, and I'm speaking openly, though my sources actually confirm it, that it was interesting call from Berlin 10 days before Washington at the highest level that that created the situation at the highest level in White House, where President Biden maybe was afraid to move further, because I felt on the Hill, in think tank community, I felt in State Department and Pentagon, I felt this support among your diplomats in NATO, American diplomats. They were ready. They were promising this step. They said, Žygis, you will be surprised. It will be okay. And then complete disaster. Vilnius was just yellow and blue. We were all standing with Ukrainian flags, waiting for Zelensky. And then I saw that flag actually not waving. It was stuck. We were trying to push it out in Lukishka Square, but it was stuck symbolically, because then we said no to Ukraine. Zelensky came to get this opening, and we said no to Zelensky from Washington. And I will dramatize it now a bit. Then when I got that signal, I was afraid, because I remember what happened after Bucharest. After 2 months, Russia invaded Georgia. We were all afraid, because weakness provokes the occupation. It didn't happen in our region. Well, we saw some Wagner moves in Belarus, but I'm just back from Israel. I'm just back from killing sites very close to Gaza. And we were finding 3 types of ammunition there: Russian, Iranian, and North Korean. For me, those are the same guys who are killing my brothers and sisters in Ukraine. And I was just thinking, well, maybe it's also because of the weakness that was shown in Vilnius. So I'm just now thinking, if we show the same weakness in Washington, D.C., if we are not opening those membership talks on, the beginning of the road at government level with Ukrainians, what might happen then? Balkans? Indo-Pacific? You guess what? But, trying to make it positive again, Biden administration will be remembered for 2 things: Afghanistan, that is kind of negative, and then Ukraine. Ukraine is something that Biden owns. He created it. I do not remember any president who was supporting Ukraine like this. But if he fails Ukraine in Washington NATO summit, if he just celebrates the past instead of the future, it will be 2 failures that this democratic administration will be remembered. And then end of democratic promotion, end of great speeches about democracy, because it was just the speeches. And actually we might provoke those autocracies, this axis of evil, that works now, not only in Middle East. I didn't mention the little accident in the Baltic Sea with some interesting Chinese ships and who are now harbored in Russian ports. Well, the war scene is expanding. This is because we show weakness. And I hope that Biden will not do it. I hope that today also Chancellor Scholz, who visited Israel actually day after our visit to Israel, will also show that strategic strength and will create the success stories like you created in Vilnius. Yeah, I'm sitting in the parliament that was surrounded by Soviet troops. I saw my friends killed by Soviet troops, but your wisdom, your strategic resolve created wonderful, great country. One of the richest now in EU. We grow like crazy. We inspire others. So, thanks, Kurt and Jan, for doing it. Now let's, pass your wisdom to this administration to make the same, at least, what you did in the Central Europe and Baltics.
Zigis, thank you. I think we probably will talk a little bit more about Israel, but I cannot avoid reminding people that the attack by Hamas took place on the day of Vladimir Putin's birthday. So as he was celebrating his 71st birthday, he was also observing what was going on with the attacks. Ian, so Zigis has very passionately expressed what he has seen in terms of U.S. support, right, for Ukraine's accession into NATO. As I said, you were there in Ukraine from the very beginning when the support was not there internally. Of course, that has completely changed. But also you were there when the administration, the Bush administration, was pushing for NATO, map, right? I would suggest perhaps that some of the narratives that Sergio has discussed working in Italy, I think might be working here as well, because there are people who are using the whole idea of, the threat of nuclear weapons and, some of those things. What say you, Ian?
Yeah. Let me just start, Nadia. Thank you for hosting this, and let me thank you and the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation for all the work it's done. Going back to the 1990s when we first crossed paths, and you were working to help Ukraine consolidate its independence. You were working to deepen its relationship to the United States. And I remember the roundtables I used to host and you used to host in Kiev back in that day about Ukraine and NATO. And I think you'd agree, even back then, there was a growing constituency of interest in NATO membership in Ukraine. It's not a recent thing. It has some deep roots that come from day one of independence. Let me just, before I hit disinformation, just second what Zigis said. And I want to thank Zigis for the leadership he gave in leading up to the Vilnius summit. Because I don't think if you had gotten the parliamentarians as involved, as supportive in Germany and the UK and Italy to support a clear roadmap to NATO membership for Ukraine, we wouldn't have come this close to getting that roadmap in Vilnius. We shouldn't look at Vilnius as a disappointment, but as a near miss that should motivate us to work even harder to get those last two votes at the NAC to get Ukraine onto that path when we have that summit in Washington. Regarding disinformation, I wanted to kind of address two bits of disinformation. One that preceded February 24th, 2022, and one that's bothering me and impairing Ukraine's membership road to NATO. The first is what I think is the most ostensible example of disinformation. And that, of course, is Putin's 2021 essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, this infamous 5,000 word opus. And in it, he asserted, and we should remember this, he asserted that Ukraine is not a real state, and that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, that Ukrainians don't constitute a true nationality. He wrote, and I'm quoting, "Ukraine is entirely the product of the Soviet era," end quote, shaped from the lands of historical Russia. Those are his words. That opus, that article, asserted that Ukraine's borders have no legitimacy and that Ukraine can only exist as a component of Russia. Those are Putin's beliefs. Anders Asland, a colleague of mine at the Atlantic Council, he called this essay a masterclass in disinformation, and he correctly described it as one step short of war. And this article that came out in the spring of 2021 and Putin's military deployments in the spring and summer of 21 should have motivated the West to take much stronger actions than it did to deter what became the second phase of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And because we brushed off this bit of disinformation, we ignored it, we dismissed it, because of that, we find ourselves where we are today, this brutal, bloody war of aggression, unjustified aggression by Russia against Ukraine. And it's important to keep this article in mind, this bit of disinformation in mind, because it reflects Putin's intentions. He is determined to eliminate the Ukrainian state. He is determined to rewrite Ukrainian history and identity on his terms. And that is something we haven't seen on this scale since World War II. So that's the classic point of disinformation upon which this war is founded, this brutal aggression, unjustified aggression is founded. But the disinformation today continues from Russia and from some other sources. But the one that is greatest concern to me, and I think it should be for our community who want Ukraine to join NATO, it's disinformation concerning Ukraine's readiness for NATO membership. This is the myth of most immediate concern, because its roots are actually not from Russia. They're in the transatlantic community. They emanate from here in the United States, even the US administration, the assertion that Ukraine is not ready for NATO membership. Look, NATO membership is absolutely an essential element to ending this war on Ukraine's terms and doing so as quickly as possible, vice as long as it takes. And it's essential to establishing and securing a peace after that Ukrainian victory. Now, key elements to that victory, a victory on Ukraine's terms that's achieved as expeditiously as possible, has three elements: supplying Ukraine with that robust military capability in terms of mass, speed of delivery, capacity, unleashing restrictions that the West has placed on the use of those weapons so it can strike legitimate military targets in Russia. You know the list. Second is exercising truly robust sanctions on the Russian economy. We haven't done that. We're still financing Putin's invasion. This is outrageous. But a third key element is placing Ukraine into the alliance. It deserves to be part of this transatlantic community. It has so much to offer this transatlantic community. It is so essential to ending this war quickly. But as long as Ukraine is denied a security guarantee from the alliance, I'm convinced Putin's going to continue his quest to re-suborn Ukrainian territory, Ukraine, and obliterate Ukrainian history and identity. As long as Ukraine is outside of NATO, that effort is going to persist. But we're not going to be able to have a serious discussion on Ukrainian accession to NATO as long as we allow the perpetuation of the falsehood that Ukraine does not meet the criteria of NATO membership. And unfortunately, NATO is actually, in Vilnius, actually agreed to language in its summit communique that's saying that Ukraine doesn't meet the requirements of NATO membership. All due respect to Zygis and his colleagues, I don't understand how Central Europeans allowed that to get into a consensus document. We have to reverse that. The assertion that Ukraine needs further reforms, further deepen its interoperability with the NATO forces, these are not grounded in the North Atlantic Treaty, and their achievement, while desirable, are far from strategic when it comes to advancing the interests of the alliance and including ending this war on Ukrainian terms. You know, when you look at the Washington Treaty, Article 10, which defines the requirements for NATO membership, there are only four. First, it has to be a European state. And last time I looked at a map, Ukraine is smack dab in Europe. Second, it has to be in a, quote unquote, a position to further the principles of the treaty. That, of course, is an allusion to the principles of democracy, democratic elections, free and fair elections. Well, Ukraine has had not only free and fair elections consistently over the last 30 years, a number of those elections have been under duress with Russian interference in those elections, yet Ukraine was able to pull off these elections. It meets the requirements when it comes down to the principles of the North Atlantic Treaty. Third, it has to be able to contribute to, quote unquote, contribute to the security of the North Atlantic. My goodness, look at the blood that Ukraine is spilling today in defense of the North Atlantic area. That says enough on that round. And then the fourth is unanimity among the member states. And as Zygis pointed out, in Vilnius, there are only two that were blocking that consensus. The assertion that Ukraine needs more reforms to meet the requirements of NATO membership is a fabricated excuse to avoid the decisions that come with Ukraine's request for NATO membership. If we're serious about supporting Ukraine's accession to NATO, and we want to see that at the Washington summit, we have to eliminate this false narrative about Ukraine's readiness and generate a greater appreciation for how Kiev's accession to NATO will strengthen the security of the transatlantic community. So let's make it a real effort between now and the Washington summit, sooner rather than later, to demand that the alliance's political leaders recognize that Ukraine meets the requirements of NATO membership. It's an imperative.
So, Kurt, as the man who was inside, right, as ambassador to NATO, you perhaps can give us some insights on, are the narratives also working inside NATO? So, for instance, what was it, in August when the aide to Stoltenberg made some remarks about that Ukraine could trade land for NATO membership, right? And then how many days after that did people have to try to walk that back? Yeah. I'm too much of a cynic to think that that was an accident. I would call it sort of maybe a trial balloon. But as you also travel to the capitals, what do you see currently? Which of these narratives are they working? Are we really breaking down? You know, the unintended consequences of Putin's full-scale invasion are perhaps helping us break down some of these narratives. But I also want to recall, Kurt, that in your many writings and talkings, particularly when you were representative for Ukraine negotiations, you really zeroed in on what I would say that words matter, right, in terms of dealing with narratives. And I recall you talking over and over again, what was this ATO, right, operation? I mean, you completely got rid of that, right? And that was actually something that the Ukrainians, right, they didn't call it a war, they call it an anti-terrorist operations. So words matter when you're trying to fight disinformation and promote your cause. So, Kurt.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Nadia. And the other big example there was on U.S. government-produced maps showing the territories that Russia occupied. It was labeled NGCO, non-government control, or NGCA, non-government controlled area. We even refused to say Russian occupied territory. It was just incredible. And we called it a frozen conflict when it was anything but. So I kept calling it a hot war, not a frozen conflict, which was important at the time and is still the case today. To your question, I'll address that first, and then I want to come back to a few points that others have brought up as well. But the first thing is, I don't actually think that the Russian narratives are working that well with that many governments in Europe. Baltic states, Poland, Italy, even France now has come out very robustly in support of Ukraine. So I don't think those narratives are cutting much ground with the governments. The exceptions to that are the US and Germany as governments. But we do have a problem with publics in the US and in Europe. A lot of support growing for far-right political parties that bizarrely but consistently align themselves with Russia's point of view. And so we do have a rising problem with that. And you see it in Germany in particular with the AfD. You see the National Front in France. You even get, well, of course you have this in Hungary. You have this in Slovakia. So this is a growing problem. And those groups are susceptible to the Russian narrative, and they do pick up on them. Now, the general points that I want to make here is, first off, number one, Russian disinformation works because it reinforces existing attitudes. So they're very smart about the narratives they choose and how to push them. For instance, the narrative that NATO is to blame for Russia's attack on Ukraine. This is something that plays into pacifist thinking in West European publics that has been around for decades. that NATO is a militarist organization, and Europe should be about peace. And so playing on that, just it resonates with a European public. Similarly, in the United States, they play on the issue of corruption in Ukraine. As Ian pointed out, there's a predisposition to thinking Ukraine's a horrible, corrupt country. So they keep hammering on that because it then undermines support for giving Ukraine financial support and military support. They use the idea of nuclear weapons. They keep threatening that they're going to do something with nuclear weapons, which reinforces this instinct from decades of the Cold War that, oh, we can't get into a nuclear war. We have to avoid nuclear war at all costs. They also play on the narrative, which frankly many people in our government here believe, that Russia is a vital partner for the United States, that we have to work with Russia because they're a big, powerful country. They're going to be around forever. They can't be defeated, and we need them to deal with other issues like climate change or Iran or whatever it might be. Of course, this is nonsense, that Russia is deliberately flaming or fanning the flames of all these global crises and issues. And yet there are many people who believe that we still need Russia somehow. So they pick up and they use these existing themes, which prove to be effective in shaping some of the understanding here. And I would say it's and one other I would mention too is the U.S. Underlying tendency towards isolationism. And this is in both parties and a historical factor in the United States for centuries. We have to be roused to get up and deal with global problems. Otherwise, our default setting is to think, why do we have to do it? Why is this our problem? Can't we focus on issues at home? Where is the U.S. interest in this? We just tend to go back to sleep or to pull back from the world. And you've seen this, president after president has won election on this theme. You've seen America First with Trump, but you had It's the Economy, Stupid with Clinton, and you had No Nation Building Abroad with George W. Bush. You had I'm going to end two wars with Barack Obama. So this is an underlying theme as well. So the Russians try to reinforce this sense of America shouldn't be doing these things. We should be looking after our own interests instead. So that's why their propaganda is so effective. Second point I wanted to bring up is related to this, is there is a narrative going on right now in Republican circles, in the Congress, you hear it on conservative radio, that somehow helping Israel is helping humanity. This is a terrible terrorist attack and brutal, and so we are defending humanity. Whereas helping Ukraine is viewed as giving money or giving aid to Ukraine. The language is different, the talk is different. It's one of them is morally right, and the other one is risky and dangerous. And you even hear people vehemently object to linking aid to Ukraine and aid to Israel in one piece of legislation, because they are trying to make a distinction between one, which is natural and right and essential and all about humanity, and the other one, which is a fool's enterprise. So we have to combat that by, as the president did, linking these conceptually as closely as possible. That what you have is evil manifested in different forms. One of them with Hamas terrorist attacks, another one with Russian government attacks, but using many of the same techniques of deliberately targeting civilians, of brutality, of executions, beheadings, and so forth, attacks on hospitals, deliberate bombing of cities. These are things that Russia and Hamas have in common. And we have to see this as one giant challenge rather than seeing these as alternatives or as different in nature. Next point, third point, is this then reinforces a point I think Ziggy's made, or maybe it was Sergio, but what we are seeing today is a spiraling out of control of chaos. We look back at a time, when Lithuania was joining NATO and mid 2000s, and even after that, even after the war in Iraq, there was relative stability to the world order. And that has changed because there is a perception in the world that the US and Europe are weak and distracted, that we don't have resolve. And we've given them lots of reasons to think this, whether it is the red lines in Syria that were crossed, whether it is the withdrawal from Afghanistan, all the stuff about ending 2 wars and pulling out of Iraq and having to go back again. And even the early days of Russia's full-scale invasion, first to say Ukraine's going to fall, offering Zelensky a ride out rather than offering him support. The negative decision-making about, well, we won't do this, we won't do that, denying this weapon system, denying that weapon system until we later changed our minds. Even President Biden's op-ed in the New York Times in April of 2022 was entitled, "What We Will Do and Won't Do to Help Ukraine." So all of this is signaling to Putin, but also to Iran, to terrorists, to China, to anyone you can think of who has grievances and ambitions to change the world order, that now's the time to act. And the more things happen and people get away with it, the more will happen. And so it is spiraling, it is escalating now, which is ironic because the goal of the administration is to avoid escalation, but the weak response is what causes the escalation. And here, what we really need from the US and Europe, it's a transatlantic challenge, is to try to reestablish a sense of order, predictability, of certainty of consequences. But that is now harder and harder each time, because now we actually have to put our money where our mouth is, or put our bullets in the guns and put the boots on the ground and make change happen. And that's going to be much more costly than it would have been to maintain the order as it was. But we are going to have to do that. And this is where NATO comes in. And I think that our European allies have understood faster and better than the US and Germany that to get this kind of democratic order back, we've got to bring Ukraine into NATO. We can't have a secure Europe, a democratic Europe, a prosperous Europe, where gray zones are temptations to Putin to attack, and we end up suffering the consequences from that. So we actually have to look at Ukraine as part of the key to getting stability, security, and prosperity back in Europe. And we need to move on that as quickly as possible, because the longer we wait, the more things will get more and more difficult, and more chaos will spin out of control. The objection that people have to bringing Ukraine into NATO in the near term is that it will cause World War III. NATO forces will be fighting Russian forces directly on the front line, and Russia will use nuclear weapons, and it'll all escalate out of control. We have to eliminate that argument. And I think the way to do it is to actually be frank about the challenges that we face and what we do. So sit down with Ukraine in the NATO-Ukraine Council, which was set up in Vilnius, or upgraded in Vilnius. Sit down in the NATO-Ukraine Council and talk with Ukraine about Article 5. What does Article 5 mean? What will NATO do to assist Ukraine in its defense? Be specific. It is at least everything we're already doing, training and equipping and advising and so forth. It should be more than that, and there are things that we can do. I would suggest that NATO should participate directly in Ukraine's air defense. I would suggest that NATO should participate in reestablishing freedom of navigation in the Black Sea. And there are probably other things that we would think of. These do not necessarily mean NATO, other NATO country forces fighting on the front lines in the trenches with Ukrainians. The Ukrainians would decide if, do they think that's needed or not. I would remind people that after 9/11, the only time we've invoked Article 5 in NATO's history, NATO did not send troops on the ground to Afghanistan initially, but NATO did respond, and NATO did have aircraft flying over the United States for air policing. So there's no automaticity to what Article 5 means. We should sit down with Ukrainians, discuss it, agree on it, and do it. And then after we're already doing it, there's no mystery about what inviting them to join NATO means, because we're already doing it. It becomes a formality. And we ought to get to that stage as quickly as possible. I hate to think of the risks that would grow for Ukraine and NATO if we let this go beyond the Washington summit.
Kurt, obviously this hour is not sufficient to really cover the ground. So I'm going to suggest that we reconvene at another time to continue this discussion. But it seems to me that everything that has been discussed really does fit into the whole idea of, Senator, you have pointed out in your conceptual framework, and I'm just going to read the sentence, that disinformation, propaganda, and strategic narratives are a phenomena that fit into the broader theme of cognitive warfare, a form of warfare in which the human mind represents the battlefield. And I think everything we're talking about really is in this framework, right? And, our colleague, General Breedlove, talks about the different components of war being, uses the DIME acronym: diplomacy, information, military, and economic. And I think there's general agreement that militarily, Putin is not doing well. But I think a lot of us believe that on the information front, he is succeeding. Sergio, you've talked about the fact that this is perhaps one of also the cheapest way to fight a war.
Yes, no, I agree with what you say, also previous speakers, about the spiraling of chaos, which is the result of the weakness of the West. I would add that Russian psychological pressure using the threat of nuclear escalation has inhibited a strong Western response in 2014, and perhaps even now it's inhibiting, because there's this fear, as the speaker said, of escalation. And so they're playing a lot with this cognitive pressure, psychological pressure of fear of nuclear war, which actually does have an impact, because there is also there is this fear that a strong Western response will provoke Russia and will lead to nuclear escalation. So I think this is what is inhibiting a kind of forward way, as speakers have said, of NATO accession for Ukraine, because there's this fear of escalation, and the Russians play on this psychological pressure. So certainly it's a cheap way of doing it. Cognitive warfare is much cheaper. I also agree that in the West it's not working very, very well. Also in Italy actually it's one of the countries in Europe where the Russians are a bit more successful in propaganda, right? I would also add, in the third world, in Latin America, in Africa, in the Middle East, they're much more successful than in the West. Yeah. So I would. So if does that answer your question?
Yes.
Yes.
So with a few minutes left, several of you brought up, of course, the horrific attack in Israel, and the issue of how people are viewing this, right? There are some that do believe it is the same evil that we've seen in Ukraine, right? And yet, as Kurt, you pointed out, that there's now efforts to separate the support for Ukraine versus support for Israel. I think this goes also to the narratives, Kurt, that you brought out about how one war is being presented, right? the horrific, slaughter of the innocents, right, that has been taking place since October the 7th. But we've had this horrific slaughter going on in Ukraine, right, for since February of 22nd. So how do you perceive, and of course now this is an election year, right? So we've got that in the mix about different candidates, including, can never remember his name, saying that, we should get out of NATO. What do you see in this last few, I guess, minutes? Maybe I'll just ask each of you to make some closing remarks about how do we move forward. Zigis, maybe I'll start with you.
Okay, just something that should be also important for America. It's not only inhuman what I saw in Israel, but everything what I saw in Ukraine, in a lot of other places of atrocities that's really spread, like now, like disease. I agree with Kurt, the world is, losing the control, but it's everywhere against United States of America. So those isolations from left and right who, perform in America, and they will perform, they should understand that somebody in organized way is killing the idea of America on this globe. For me, maybe I'm too sensitive, but it's like 39, like Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Like when I see all those guys in Beijing, meeting with Russians, then with Hamas, I think they made a deal to kill that idea. And in each region, they have a plan how to get rid of American viruses. It shouldn't happen. And I think we are living now the most historic period. Like those 12 months will be decisive on America's future. So wake up, brothers. Let's, little by little, let's restore the order. And I agree with Kurt. If we do it in Ukraine, like Father of Jan was always saying, this is the central place, the masterpiece of Europe, whole and free. Seal that freedom in Ukraine, in EU and NATO. You will get rid of 70% of your headaches on the globe. Thank you.
Ian?
I guess I would say I would second Kurt's concern that we're now catching ourselves in a phase where we have growing instability and violence globally. And Ukraine in some way was kind of the kickoff event of that spread. We have, look at the events in the Indo-Pacific, Chinese ships running over Filipino ships. We have the crisis in Israel and Gaza. We have Ukraine. It kind of rests, I think, unfortunately, in a growing perception that the United States, and here I say it also, the transatlantic community, has lost its determination to fight for its principles, to fight for its interest, to fight for the interests and values of democracy in our neck of the woods and globally. And that has spurred opportunism by our adversaries. And of course, that was demonstrated brutally in Ukraine. And our actions there, as some of our colleagues have mentioned, has been defined by, incrementalism, hesitancy. One can even make the case that we've been coerced by nuclear coercion by Putin, limiting our steps of support for Ukraine. These have implications that create instability and unrest and violence, not only just in Ukraine, but globally. So when it comes to Ukraine, we have to evolve out of this strategy of incrementalism and hesitation. And first and foremost, embrace Ukraine's war objectives. We have yet to do that. We have to have absolute clarity that we support Ukraine's objectives, which is total territorial reintegration of the occupied territories back to the 91 borders, unambiguously. Second, we have to embrace and act on Ukraine's aspirations to join NATO. That is absolutely imperative to convincing Putin that we're serious about Ukraine, and Ukraine is off the table. It's not in the gray zone. It's not available for conquest. And to reinforce that, we have to be serious about providing the equipment Ukraine needs and do it now with urgency, because the longer this war drags on, the weaker Ukraine's going to get. And just a matter of mass differentials that shows that Russia has the advantage in the long run. And then finally, the West has to get serious about economic sanctions on Russia to really squeeze not only its capabilities to generate the capacities for battle, but also to start making the Russian people really feel pressure, so that they start thinking about Putin's war in different ways. Those are the things that we need to do with urgency when it comes down to helping Ukraine win this war on its terms, and doing so quickly.
Before I get to Kurt, Ian, you mentioned the sanctions. I would just like to remind everybody that the Friends of Ukraine network really came into formality organization in March of 2014. And the very first recommendation papers had to do with sanctions, what sanctions needed to be in place. And unfortunately, very few of those sanctions were implemented, and some of them remain to this day. Not only the sanctions, but the issue, we'll have a webinar discussion next week on Halloween. I'm calling it trick or treat. So for most children, they're going to be treats, but for the children of Ukraine, it's tricks. Not only because of the constant bombing, but also of the businesses that remain in Russia, like Mars and Mandalay, who are helping to fund Putin's war. So on the one hand, we have U.S. citizen, taxpayers sending money of assistance, and then we have businesses that are continuing to do business and provide revenues for Putin. And talking about the moral clarity, Kurt, that you were talking about, describing the wars in now Israel and Ukraine, we cannot forget the thousands, tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of kidnapped children, right? Which has been defined as a genocide. So we need to remind ourselves and the world about all of these things. So Kurt, I'm sorry. So for any closing remarks from you.
Hi, I'm there. I'm dealing with a phone call at the same time.
I'm sorry.
Very, very quickly, because we don't have no time left. But I would just say we need to be clear on 4 things: values, goals, strategy, and alliances. If we can do that, we can prevail. And what do I mean by that? We have to be clear about our human and democratic values and be willing to stand up for them. Second, we need to have clear goals. What are we trying to do? This is one of the things that is killing the administration on its Ukraine policy. Despite all the good work it's doing, it can't articulate what the goal is. And they lose support domestically as a result. Third, we got to have a strategy to achieve the goals. So once we say we are going to see Russian forces defeated in Ukraine, then we know, okay, how do we do that? We provide the military means, we provide the economic means, etc. And then the final thing is alliances. We have to recognize that we are strongest when we are acting together with allies. Dictators and terrorists don't have allies. They have at best a marriage of convenience sometimes. But we have real allies, both in governments that are capable and in people who believe in the same shared values that we have. So we have to pull ourselves together around that set of themes: values, goals, strategy, and alliances.
Thank you so much. Our hour is up. I think I will thank you all for today, and I will reconvene with your permission for us to continue this very important, critical discussion sometime in the near future. Thank you so very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia.
Thank you.